Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Lindley, and as Chancellor of the University of Reading, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here today. Thank you for joining us in this truly inspirational setting beneath this amazing Gaia artwork. I'm sure you'll agree that all those who visit the artwork over this next week will be filled with thought-provoking ideas and be truly inspired. And of course, it forms the perfect centerpiece to an engaging set of events that we have through this week with the community that forms part of Reading Climate Week, Festival Week. As you know, climate change remains one of the biggest challenges facing the planet. Recent impacts of extreme weather have been making the headlines just this last week. We've seen wildfires, floods, and extremes of temperatures, all being experienced across all the continents and all absolutely consistent with what the climate science has been telling us for decades. And we're at a pivotal moment in addressing the challenges that the planet faces. The choices that we make in this decade, globally, nationally, locally, and in our own homes, will have consequences for many centuries to come. And of course, the scale of the issue means that it can often feel completely overwhelming to us as individuals. And it's hard to see how we each can make a difference in our day-to-day lives that makes a difference to our planet. It's all too easy to feel powerless, and that the contribution we can do as concerned citizens is just too small. But I hope this evening can help us nudge that perspective a degree or two. And I think perspective is vitally important. The key moment for me in becoming passionate and urgent over climate change, and when my consumer behaviour permanently changed, was not on seeing this big, blue, detailed, wonderful marble before us, but in being given this photograph for a recent birthday. It's called the pale blue dot. And the focus of this picture is exactly the same as the Gaia, the Earth. Do you see it? There it is, that tiny blue dot in the arc of light. And that's us. That's everything we know from the perspective of 4 billion miles away. The photo was taken by the spacecraft Voyager 1 in 1990, as it turned for one last time to look back at Earth before becoming the first human-made object to leave our solar system. It's deeply affected my perspective, especially when looked at whilst hearing the words it inspired from the person who persuaded NASA to take the picture, an astronomer called Carl Sagan. And he said, if you can raise the lights a little bit so I can read what he said. He said, "From this distant vantage point, the Earth may not seem of any particular interest. But for us, it's different. Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That is us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being that ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilizations, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, every hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on that small mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. And he went on to say, the earth is the only world known so far to harbour life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit, yes. Settle, not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the earth is where we must make our stand. There is perhaps no better determination to the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. And he said, to me, it underscores the responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we have ever known. So it is in our hands as to whether we truly cherish our only home. Yet currently, we've made it sick. But to me, the vastly different perspectives of our earth here has helped me see the different perspectives in caring for it, the value of the small, invisible steps we can each take, as well as the giant leaps we can take together, each of us getting towards our own and its well-being. So, with perspective in mind, and from the position of belief that we each can do something meaningful to help it thrive, our talk this evening will focus on how the combined actions of many can make a significant difference and explore the very practical and accessible changes that you and I can make each day that will really add up. Our special guest is somebody who has very much embraced making sustainable choices for her and her family and has become a keen advocate for everyone to do the same. Laura Tobin will be most familiar to many of you through presenting her meteorological forecasts on national television every morning. As a Reading graduate, a climate ambassador, and a fellow of the Royal Meteorological Society, Laura has also been working to raise awareness of climate change for over 10 years. Knowing how devastating climate change can be and how overwhelmed people can feel as they wonder how to help, Laura has been on an evocative journey to find the best ways to live more sustainably and reduce her family's impact on the environment. So I'm personally very excited to hear more about her experience and her practical advice on ways we can all make those small changes that add up to the big difference for our one planet. Both the big blue marble and the tiny pale dot. So please join me in giving a huge Reading welcome to Laura Tobin. Welcome, Laura. Thank you. Okay, welcome, Laura. Back in Reading.
Can I just say that when I do the weather normally, there's one camera on me. Everyone in the gallery is thinking about the next thing that's going on. So to have this many faces on me is quite scary. Scarier than presenting to 1 million people on telly.
Well, we've got 3 cameras on you and we don't know what's going to happen next, so even more pressure. So, Laura, back in Reading, I don't know how often you're here, but before we get into it, it'd be really interesting to know about your memories of Reading and your student days here and what you thought and what you remember.
So I have a twin brother, and we both loved maths, we both loved physics. I was at school and I learned about the jet stream with my geography teacher at 14, and that day I phoned the Met Office and I said, I want to be a weather forecaster. And I did A-level maths and physics, and I knew that for me, meteorology was the only place to do it was at Reading. I went to the University of East Anglia as well, and I remember my brother went to UEA to look around with my dad, and I went to look around with my mum, and I just went, oh, I hate it. And he loved it. And then we all came to the University of Reading. He looked around with my dad, and he said, nah, it's not for me. And I remember walking up to the meteorology department, and if you haven't seen it, the meteorology word is in metal, and the sun hit it and then just glinted into my eye, and I was like, here, this is where I'm meant to be. So it was really funny that we had the same experience on the same day, but our hearts were drawn to different places. So mine was instantly drawn to the University of Reading. I loved the campus, I loved how green it was, I loved that it's so close to town, I have fantastic friends who I'm still friends with, so my whole university experience was really positive. And I met my husband at the university. In the physics department, there were 70 boys and 5 girls. So
everything came together already. Probably an RG1 in those days.
Yeah.
So last year you had your book published, Everyday Ways to Save the Planet. Ta-da! And one of the things that you mentioned in there is the joy you get from looking at satellite images of the Earth from space and seeing our blue marble in all its glory. Now, every one of the rest of us who've walked into this room has been awe-inspired by what's in front of us. You equally so, given you see this stuff so often?
Oh, yeah. The first thing you say when you see this is, wow. I've broadcast the weather once before when the guy was at a cathedral, and it's in settings like this where it just looks so spectacular. But you're meant to have the feeling that astronauts would from space looking back at it. I think it's called the Earthrise effect. So I think that is what it does. It makes you just think, wow, it's huge, even on this scale, and we're so insignificant. And the funny thing is, we didn't know how each other's talks were going to start, but I also was going to start talking about space. Space travel and climate change, they might seem that they don't really go hand in hand. Rockets go into space with huge emissions and rocket fuel. But a few years ago, William Shatner became the oldest person to go to space. And if you think about it, he's an accomplished actor. He's seen everything the world has to see. There can't be very many things that would excite him too much or really put him off kilter. But he went up with Jeff Bezos into space, and he looked down at Earth, and it overwhelmed him. And the video of him arriving down on Earth, he was just crying. He was crying his eyes out. And I wrote down a few of the things that he said when he landed on Earth. And he said, everybody in the world needs to see this. It's unbelievable. What you've given me is the most profound experience. I'm so filled with emotion about what just happened. I hope I never recover from this. Seeing the curvature of Earth, seeing the beginning and the end. As you go up, it's bright, beautiful colors. And then, whoop, in a second, it's black. The darkness of space. Everybody in the world needs to see this. He said, the world is so beautiful. It's taken 5 billion years to generate, and one day it will be gone. And he just, at that moment, became a climate advocate, and he now champions to protect our planet. So somebody of that age and that experience to be so overwhelmed by seeing this from space. Yeah. Space tourism, I don't think is a good thing, but taking people from all walks of life to see Earth and how it could change them and that could change the whole planet, I just think is amazing.
So when leaving university, if I offered you be a meteorologist and help share the climate change impact with us, or be an astronaut, where would you go?
Well, I'll stick with what I do, and I'll send my daughter to space. Okay?
It's not too late yet, Laura, you can go.
My husband would choose to send me to space, but just a one-way ticket, I'm sure of that.
But you were telling me, as we were chatting just before coming on, that you recently went to French Guiana to see one of the space launches, the Jupiter mission, and you must have pinched yourself to think, I'm being paid to be here, and this is exactly everything.
I cry a lot at things like that.
So you touched on when you were 14 and you sort of had the moment of you knew what you wanted to be, but what is it about climate science that really inspires you, it really intrigues and gets to you?
I think that I've always loved the weather. It's the thing that we talk about, well, I say it's the thing we talk about the most. It was, and then we had COVID, and we had Brexit, and then we had a million new prime ministers. We're probably back to weather, particularly this week, everyone is just talking about the weather. And I love science, and I think it's really important to say it is hot and sunny because high pressure is here, and high pressure is a force field that keeps weather fronts at bay, and the hot air comes from here. And I think if you have a bit of science, it gives you understanding of what's going on. So I've always liked to just add a little bit, and you'll hear somebody go, oh, it's really hot today because the jet stream's here. And I think, oh, they're listening. But for me, it started with a passion of weather and the joy of telling that every day. And then increasingly I'd say to my newsroom, oh, there's been this extreme weather event here. There's been some severe weather there. There's been a record temperature, a record rainfall. And it became that they would just go, oh yeah, Laura, another record, another extreme weather event. Let's just pick and choose them, shall we, the ones we talk about. And I kind of would say, oh yeah, just to get them on air. And then actually you're realizing over the last 5 or 10 years, all of those things are becoming more and more common. Yeah. And that just points to climate change. And I'm really lucky that my work let me now talk about climate change, mainstream breakfast telly. I do my weather forecast, I keep that time precious, but on Thursday we talked about the wildfires in Canada and the terrible scenes in New York of the orange skyline with the worst pollution they've ever had. Friday we talked about the fact that we're now in El Nino, that the Pacific is warming, and that will likely make us have the hottest year ever recorded next year because the water holds so much heat and touches the atmosphere. Monday, I talked about record ocean temperatures in the North Atlantic and how that will affect potentially hurricane season and storms. And today I talked about hot nights and how much more frequent they're becoming. So I talk about climate change much more often, and I feel like the two just go hand in hand.
Yeah. And as you've seen that over this part of your career, our understanding of climate science has moved forward tremendously. But the day-to-day impacts, you've just talked about a week, which probably isn't an unusual week, and the rest of us sort of see it. So what are the key changes that you've seen, and how worried should we be about, what the rest of us don't really understand but sort of feel rather than know?
Everything is, the end of this story is not good, but we can make it a bit better. Everything is just getting worse, quicker, happening more frequently. So the last 8 years on Earth have been the 8 warmest we've ever recorded. The last decade is the warmest decade we've ever recorded. Carbon dioxide in May was the highest that we've ever recorded on Earth, and it is continuing to rise. The ocean heat content, I talked about that. The whole ocean at the moment is about a degree higher than it should be. The scale that we are off the charts into untold territories is absolutely terrifying. And we only just have to look at all the more frequent, more extreme weather events that are happening closer and closer to home as well, that you join the dots and you just know it's climate change. And it would be wrong not to show our next slide, which is just a very simple visualization that Earth is getting hotter. And this is obviously by the fantastic Ed Hawkins, a professor at the University of Reading, who wanted to not have boring graphs with axes. He wanted to say every single line on here from 1850 through to present day on the right-hand side, every single line represents the temperature on Earth compared to average. So blue is when it's cooler than average, red is when it's warmer than average. You don't need to know how many degrees hotter or cooler. Red is warmer, and there's a big bunch of red at the end, and it's coming in very quickly. And that is what is most concerning.
Well, I know, so you know all this stuff, obviously, you're very passionate about it. I was wondering when the moment came where you sort of wanted to become an advocate and a campaigner and an encourager for the rest of us to change our behaviours for what you know is coming. I know in your book, A Visit to Svalbard, perhaps was that seminal moment, but do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, sure. Oh, it's okay, you can stay there. So I forgot to mention these. So I talked about record temperatures that have happened. In the summer of 2021, Canada in Lytton, on the left-hand side, they had the highest temperature they've ever recorded in Canada. It was nearly 50 degrees Celsius, which is hotter than it's ever been in LA. And LA is thousands of miles further south. They were having this intense heat wave. And they broke their temperature record by 5 degrees Celsius. I can just tell you that is unheard of and incredible. It's like Usain Bolt, who runs the 100 meters in 9.58 seconds, suddenly running it in 7 seconds. Everyone would say, well, that's not possible, humanly not possible. Something is going on here. Let's do a drug test because this isn't possible. To break a temperature record by half a degree is quite something, but to have broken it by 5 degrees was just incredible. And then the next day, they had wildfires and 90% of the town burnt down. And that's the impacts we're starting to feel. That's sort of closer to home in Canada, and that story for me was much easier to get on Good Morning Britain. Low-lying, tiny islands in the Pacific, further away, out of most people's minds, and not that easy to get into people's minds. But that's why this guy, who's I think he's the mayor of Tuvalu, a tiny little island in the Pacific, or an archipelago of islands, he had 9, he now has 7, sea levels are rising, and he stood there in the water and presented to COP26 to show them how the sea level has risen and how he's about to lose his islands. And it's things like that that are really, really powerful. Kind of gone a bit out of order now. We can go. And then this was a big deal for me. This was last summer when we had the highest temperature the UK's ever recorded. We broke 40 degrees Celsius. When I was here at the University of Reading, this was something that we projected to happen by 2050 because of climate change in the summer. So the top forecast is actually from about 6 years ago from a program I did looking at what our future could look like. And then that was the forecast, the actual reality last summer. And me and my friends have got a weather WhatsApp group. It's really interesting. And about 10 days before, we were going, oh my goodness, the computer model's saying there's going to be 40 degrees. And a guy called John Mitchell, who's the one of our northern weather presenters who was about to retire, said, guys, take it with a pinch of salt, but isn't it crazy that the science, the computer science says it's possible? And as we got closer and closer to the event, we realized it was going to become reality. And after I did this broadcast, and this might sound ridiculous, I actually had a little cry because I couldn't believe that that potential future we were trying to avoid had become a reality. So that was pretty devastating, as was my next bright story. I went to Svalbard. So Svalbard is an archipelago north of Norway, between Norway and the North Pole. I'm just holding ice because it looks cool. There was no other reason to have this picture. But we went there because we wanted to look at the impacts of climate change. And I was offered the chance to go. And this makes me sound like a terrible mum, but the dates were chosen without me in mind. That was who would host us. And I actually missed my daughter's first day and first week at school ever. But this trip for me was too important not to say yes to, and for her to understand why I wanted to go was really important as well. So it was, I knew the science. I'd spoken to one of the scientists at the Met Office who'd written the cryosphere report, and the cryosphere is anything frozen. And I thought, I know the science. I know that glaciers are retreating. I know on average we're slicing 24 meters off the top of a glacier. It's causing sea level rise. Do we really need to go? And my director said, we've got these great hosts. We've got some big new stats. And the stats were that Svalbard's warming more than anywhere on planet Earth, 6 times faster than the rest of the planet. And the impacts, therefore, are really visible in a really small timescale. So on the day we arrived, I went here to the Borberine Glacier, and there I am standing pretty much at the end of the glacier, right down the hill, like past where it's really black, just over that hill, I was taken to when I arrived, and that's where the glacier ended 40 years ago. And I was there, I was going to be 40 that month. And the guide said to me, look, stand here, and half a mile up the road is how far the glacier's retreated in 40 years. And then he said, look up. And it just so happens the black line where the sun is casting a shadow is about 10 meters high. He said 10 meters high, all the way up that hill, is all the ice we've lost. And that's not that glacier, that's every glacier, the whole of Svalbard, and pretty much the whole of the Arctic going into the sea, causing sea level to rise. We then met a guy from the tourist board who took us out on the fjord, the East Fjord, which stands for Ice Fjord, but it doesn't freeze over anymore. 2017, the first winter, it didn't freeze over. He couldn't take people out on sledges, he couldn't take people out on snowmobiles, dog rides. He had to phone everyone and say, there's no ice, I can't take you out. For 2 years, he had no business. He had to come up with completely new plans to do things inland. The snow season is shorter, the rain season is longer, and polar bears haven't got the ice that they want to get on haven't got the ice that they would need. The waters there aren't Arctic waters anymore. It's warming, it's Atlantic water. So the fish are the wrong kind of fish for polar bears, so they're dying in droves. The reindeer can shuffle through snow to get their food, but if it freezes because of water and then turns to ice, they can't use their hooves to break, so their reindeers are dying in population in droves as well. So I saw the landscape changes, I saw the effect on the economy, and I saw the effect on the wildlife, and that's what made me realize how devastating it was. And that's the pictures taken 100 years apart to show how the glaciers are retreating. And the reason they're so important is it's not just because ice is cold to keep us cold. Ice is, you think about tennis players, they wear a white t-shirt because white reflects the heat back into space, whereas the dark surface absorbs it. So the more the ice melts, the less it can help to cool our planet. It absorbs more of the dark land or sea, which makes us even warmer. So it's just this positive feedback loop, which is just catapulting.
Well, we can all see the passion
That was
that's
a really
ignited
short answer
in
to
you.
your question.
Well,
Sorry.
From what I'm thinking as you're saying that is, you knew the science before this. I'm sure you'd read the books and you'd seen the predictions, but being there and making you feel in your heart as well as your head, this is real, this is what's happening. And the things that you'd noticed that you wouldn't have noticed from the books has come back, and the privileged position you're in to be able to share this every day and write your book, that's the fire that we can see, that's the fire that's within you. So far so bad, and I'm sure it's continued to be a little bit bad, but I do know that you attended COP26 in Glasgow a couple of years ago, and that you came back quite filled with hope. There was commitment, there was capacity sort of talked about there so that we can avoid the worst scenarios that the temperature increases that are coming through. So 18 months or so further on, how do you feel about progress since then? Are you as optimistic and as hopeful as you were then?
I am, because I feel like I have to be, and I think the will is there for lots of the big nations. It's just very, very slow. And I think the big thing about COP26, the whole phrase was keeping 1.5 alive. So we've already warmed by 1.2 degrees since pre-industrial times. 1.5 is what we want to keep it below, to keep the very worst effects of climate change at bay, and we're already seeing them now. And every country, or nearly every country, signed up to that with pledges, and we now need those pledges to become policies. And it's the first time that science was at the front and center of a COP, where everybody went, yes, we get the science, we understand it, we now realize the reality, and we're listening to the science, and the scientists are using words they've never used before. So I felt really positive, because even I hosted an event for the UN at their Innovation Center. So it was around the transition of Biden becoming the new president of America, Trump going out, who wasn't signed up to the Paris Agreement. And even within America, we were talking to sub-nations about how they're making commitments to make change. Even if their big leader doesn't want it, sub-nations can do it on their small scale, realize the positive outcomes for their communities, and that can be upscaled to larger communities and then eventually to countries. So I felt really positive from COP26. And then I went to COP27, which is our next slide, which was in Africa. It was the first African COP. And the difference there was that Africa is a continent that is most disproportionately affected by climate change. It's a very poor nation. They have the longest heat waves. They have more people dying because of the impacts of climate change, because they're very poor and they're still developing. But it's really important that they can develop with the help of developed nations' money to make sure that their coal power plants are replaced with green alternatives, so that young girls are educated, so that they can become farmers for their families and not be married off young and have 10 children, which adds to population increase. Not pointing fingers, I'm just saying that there was lots and lots of people there showing what people in Africa are doing, and they don't want the handouts. I spoke to a farmer who was given some money by the UN. He helped to plant small trees. He's grown these small trees into bigger trees, and he now sells them on to help people with flood defenses. And he has enough money to do that, and he wants to help more and more people do that. So again, I was inspired by the work that people are doing at much lower levels, showing the people up there that actually everybody does want and is ready for the change.
Right. You felt they were listening?
Yeah.
Great. Well, I mean, I think that's a great, another way to look at perspective, and what we'll come on to talk about is the little ways that we all as individuals can make a difference, but you're seeing the other perspective of our governments and these international organizations, and that's giving you a little bit of hope as well. So Svalbard obviously ignited a piston for you, but I know from your book, another seminal moment for you was when your daughter was born, and I know in your book you write a letter to your daughter, very heartfelt, but talking about the damage that we've done, and your promise to play a part for her hopes and of the future and the difference that we can all make. Would you just summarise that letter as though you were talking to all of us with that letter?
I can go one better. I'll read an extract at the end.
Okay, go for it.
So I love weather, I love climate, I love trying to communicate it. But as soon as I had her, and as soon as I came back from Svalbard, I just thought, wow, if she visited when she was 40, it would look very different. Would there be the ice? Would there be the polar bears? And that's when I was even more fueled to go, we have to make a difference. We have to make a change. And I am bringing her up to be my little eco warrior. We do litter picks on the way home from school. And she just understands things that I think even we don't as grown-ups think about. So if I go and put something in the bin, she'll say, Mummy, what are you doing? Are you recycling that? I said, well, no, this thing can't be recycled, like, show her. And I say, and she's like, so you just put it into the bin and then that goes into a hole in the ground and we cover it up and forget about it. I'm like, oh, yeah. But every time we throw something away, that doesn't go into our heart, but it goes into her heart. She thinks about it. So that's why we have to do our litter picks every week. That's why we have an allotment and we grow all of our own vegetables. And there's lots and lots of things that you can't recycle. So we make sure that we have lots of bags and we have a big collection at her school. And I take huge bags of things that can't be recycled at curbside, like crisp packets and sweet wrappers and food pouches, so that we know we're making a difference. Even the other day, we went to my parents-in-law and they had some chicken at the end of chicken dinner. And my mother-in-law put it in a bag, a plastic bag, and Charlotte went, no, Grandma, we don't use plastic bags. And plus we love her Tupperware containers. They're like much more expensive than the ones we would buy. So I made her like put it into a Tupperware container and we sort of explained why we don't use plastic bags. And then she said, you're brainwashing your daughter to not have plastic. But it's just the little thing, you know, there is no need to have that plastic bag, Tupperware container, wash it out, use it again. And it's just a little mindset change.
Oh, I bet your heart beat with pride as the little mini-me told Grandma what she thought. You know, and you just explained there is your home life and the things that you do. And, you know, I'm sure you know, like the rest of us, that it's difficult sometimes, juggling your life and wanting to do the right thing and not necessarily knowing how and sometimes not being able to. So before I get on to sort of questions about different aspects of things we can do, just how practically does your mindset immerse yourself in working out what changes you can do? How do you identify the changes in your day-to-day habits?
First of all, don't do what I did when I first wrote the book. Oh, look, a book, I wrote a book. Don't try and do everything at once. You have to do what was within your means and within your realms and within your financial capabilities and within your time. I don't think it's money that's the issue with becoming greener. I think it is having the time. So we walk to and from school. It is less than a mile. It takes a long time. It's taken us an hour to get home from school before, because she just likes to look at nature. She likes to look at the ladybirds or the snails. We like to collect things. We do a litter pick. And actually, we walk and it's free. We're breathing air from a road that is busy, that's polluted, but if fewer people drove, then our lungs would be less polluted. And we have exercise, we have fresh air, we educate ourselves, and we have some really nice bonding time. And when I went to Svalbard on my trip, I met this lovely guy called Kim Holman from the Norwegian Polar Institute. And one thing he said that will stay with me, and I realize it now more than I did before, there are no things that you can do, no changes you can make to tackle climate change that are not positive. He got frustrated when people say, oh, you have to sacrifice this, or you can't do this, or you can't do that. But they're changes that in the long run help you and help everybody. I mean, at my work in Manchester, in one of our offices, in the whole tower block, they decided to make Meat-Free Monday. Gosh, the outroar, because they were taking away meat, so they stopped it. And then 6 months later, they introduced Tasty Tuesday, where everything was meat-free. But because it was billed as a positive rather than a negative, everyone loved it. So I just think you just have to stop and look at what you can do. We have one car in our house. It causes difficulties sometimes. It might mean that I can't meet a friend. It might mean my husband, it's not too far, he will cycle. But we just make sure that we can juggle one car so there's fewer emissions. And the sacrifices that we maybe didn't go out with somebody that day, but we stayed home and did something nice as well.
Yeah. So taking step by step and sort of ordering things. So in your book, you obviously cover lots of things that we can do at home and as individuals. So let's delve into some of those now. So first of all, let's look at energy saving. You know, energy costs have obviously been at the front of all of our minds over this last year. And the solutions are there, but home insulation, new boilers and solar panels don't seem very easy when you're faced with them. So how do you think we should think about that to encourage us to sort of begin to think about adopting them?
There are loads of things. So first of all, when you look at the emissions of an average household in the UK, 75% are how we heat our homes, how we travel, and what we eat. So heating is a really big, it's about 25% of our emissions, but it's also a large amount of our cost. So actually, I was talking to a lady at work and she said, I've been telling all my kids to turn the lights off. I've been telling everyone just to boil the water you need, turn everything off at the wall, stop leaving things on standby. But she was doing that because of the cost of living crisis, while at the same time also helping to save the planet because it reduces their footprint. So there's all of these things that we can do in our household, small things, that will reduce our cost. If you, in the winter, lower your thermostat by just 1 degree, that will lower your annual bill by 10%. That is absolutely huge. So it's all of those little changes that you can make that people are doing to save money that will also save the planet. And we've just had new windows fitted in our house. They cost a lot of money. One thing I haven't said is my husband is really tight. Like he literally hates spending money. In the back of my book, because I wrote a book, I say I'd like to thank my husband for being not just the nicest man on the planet, the tightest one on it too. and I showed him that I'd written that, and he went, I'm not the nicest person on the planet. He didn't mind how I said how tight he was. So lots of the things that we already do, we do because he wants to save money. You know, I wouldn't visit our house in the winter. Generally, it's quite cold. He will turn the heating like off. He says it's just down, but he turns it like to 14 in the winter to leave the house. Then we come back in, we're allowed to turn it up to 18. We start at 18, and if everyone in the house feels it's still too cold, group decision, can we turn it up to 19 maybe? We went to the kitchen once and then went back into the living room to ask a friend what drink he wanted. He was doing star jumps. That was how cold he was. He was waiting, trying to keep warm. Since our daughter's been born, he's been a bit kinder. She does like thick layers and lots of blankets. And if my parents try and turn it to 20, he genuinely gets outraged that they're taking the... And I'm like, they're not, they just want to be warm. Everything is kind of dialed down. We've always turned everything off at the wall. So lots of our energy saving things are because of him, and he searched really hard to get a good deal on our insulation, on our windows, and he watches the smart meter like a hawk. And we've already seen the savings, and I think that the cost of our windows savings, it will be a long term, it's somewhere between 5 and 10 years it'll be paid back. But wall insulation is about 1.5 years, roof insulation is about 2 years. So if you're living in your property for at least 2 to 5 years, it's worth investing in all of those things, definitely.
So do you think the reason a lot of people don't do some of those things is they don't know, it's a communication challenge? Or do you think that we're also not linking that economic and green sort of agenda together in our lives? You know, the smart meter sounds to me like a very simple thing that will get us thinking about where we're using electricity and power on a day-to-day basis that other things go from, which isn't the hundreds of pounds or thousands of pounds.
And I think a smart meter, you can see the energy usage, but you can see your money. And that's where the two go hand in hand. But you know, the initial outlay for windows or for wall or ceiling insulation is expensive, and there were government incentives, and then they weren't, and they weren't, and they weren't. But you know, the more people that have these things, the cost should come down. One thing, air source heat pumps are going to become a big thing for us to heat our homes. One thing no one really ever talks about is, so it takes in air, and in the winter it takes in cold air and it makes your house hot. But does the opposite in the summer. It takes the hot air and makes you cold. In a world where we're getting hotter in the summer, it gives you aircon. You know, the big concern is people are going to start buying air conditioning units, plugging them in, and that's really terrible. So air source heat pumps are the future and will be. I spoke to a lady in Norway where it's obviously very cold, and they had a big government incentive in the 80s where they put a lot of tax on gas boilers, they put lots of subsidies on people having air source heat pumps, and now about 60% of properties have them there, and the more people had them, the cost came down. That's exactly what we need. We just don't have the infrastructure right now to scale it up, to make the cost viable for people. But when we do, it's just going to take off and it's going to run. So it's the people who are most affluent in society who can buy them to then bring the cost down so that it becomes affordable for everybody. Okay.
So you talked there about homes, transport and food. So let's go on to transport and, you know, the need for us to drive less, I suppose. But then again, it's difficult because if we've got kids to get to school, some of us work a long way from home, public transport doesn't work sometimes. So how can we help people make that shift around their transport habits?
I mean, for me, having just one car, we take a car journey as a precious thing, a precious commodity. If I wanted something like bread or milk, I'm not just going to pop to the shop and get it, I will walk. And I think that actually the worst journeys are the little short journeys that are just a couple of miles here or there, to town, to school, to the shops, because you've forgotten something, you need to pop here, you've forgotten a birthday present or a card or wrapper. I try and be as organised as possible, and I write lists. I love a list, love a list. There's a tick list in the back of my book. That's how much I love a list. But I write down things I need to do. So I will go to town and buy in bulk the cards I need, the presents I need, the wrap I need. If I have things I want to return, I'll make sure I do it in one go. So I might only go to town once a month, but try and get all those things done. Like I said, my husband cycles my daughter to school. I walk her home from school. Yesterday, I felt like a hero weather forecaster. Actually did my job to my daughter. And the sky greyed over. We were coming back from school. She was walking really slowly again. And I said, Charlotte, we need to walk quickly because it's going to rain. She's like, how do you know? I was like, that's my job. Like, we talk about this all the time, Charlotte. I said, look, here, the sky's greying over. And then suddenly this huge gust of wind came. And luckily, she needed a wee. We went past a garage. So we ran into the garage. And then by the time we came out, there was hail and thunder and lightning. I love thunderstorms. She doesn't. She doesn't really like them very much. And I try and tell her how exciting they are and how it's energy, how it's God moving his furniture around, throwing bits of ice. She's not buying into any of it. She's just not interested. And everyone was at the door of the service station. And I've got like a little app on my phone that you can see where lightning is and when you're going to hear the thunder. So a little dot appears and then like a little ring comes out. It's called lightningmaps.org, I think. A little ring comes out at the speed of sound. And I was saying to her, I was like, in any second now, we're going to hear the thunder in 3, 2, and you heard it. And everyone looked at me, like I was God. Like, how did she know it was going to come in this second? I don't even know what the question was, but I just was saying I was a hero weather forecaster. And everyone was going, they were like literally going, when do you think it's going to clear? And I was going, I think it's going to clear in like 5 minutes. We probably should wait. They're like, you're going to wait. I was like, I'm going to wait. And they were all doing it, and they were all waiting for me to leave because I just had this line to God, just go, what's happening next? Go on, tell me.
What a party trick.
And and the hail, there were all different types of hail. Clear hail, like hail with different layers. And she had a raincoat, I didn't. I was not such a hero weather forecaster. So I sent her out to collect the hail, bring the hail back, and then she was showing everyone the hail. So.
A magician, that's what you are. So recycling then, another area that we can all make a difference with, but again, everything is so packaged.
Yeah.
How do you find the best ways to reduce that type of waste and recycle more?
The problem is, recycling is a minefield, and it really shouldn't be. And everyone is really busy, and it's little things like turning the pack over and reading, can you probably, if you have a pack of chicken, say, need to take that plastic film off, and that needs to be clean, you need to put it in recycling. My friends hate it when I come to their houses, because I just tell them how they're recycling incorrectly, and they're just like, oh no, what's she gonna say? So my friend, we had chicken fajitas one night, and she just put the whole chicken pack just in her recycling, and I was like, are you done? She was like, oh no, clearly not. So I said, oh, well, you take the plastic film off, and Tesco and Co-op now recycle those, so I've got a separate bag at home, so she now has, she said she did, a bag to put them in. And I said, and the carton has to be clean, cleanish, cleaner than it is right now. So then she went to wash it up, and I was like, no, just the dregs of your washing up water is absolutely fine. Then just rinse it and then just pop that in the end. So, that's a tiny thing, that it's knowing that, things have to be clean. So I hadn't realised why. So yogurt pots and milk cartons is because they go along the line of the recycling factory, and a jet of air blows them. So if they have surplus food in, they're too heavy and they won't get pushed off the conveyor belt. Even little things like, I hadn't realised until I did my research that if you're recycling cardboard, you can't put pizza boxes in most recycling areas into your cardboard waste, because the grease clogs up the machines and it contaminates them, because most recycling is done in cold water and not warm water. So you would rip one half and put it in the bin, and the other half that was clean, you put it in your recycling. And there's this thing called wish cycling. You have some packaging, you've read the sign, it's got a triangle, it's a 5, you're not sure what that means, and you go, I'll put it in the recycling. I feel really good. It's going to be recycled. You're just wishing you've done the right thing. If you put the wrong thing in recycling, it makes the whole batch obsolete. It means that it ruins it all, and then that will end up going into landfills. So bizarrely, if you're not sure, you should just put it in the bin.
Oh dear. Well, that's...
I know.
Just thinking about my household habits or something.
But we have bags at home. So the curbside recycling are the things that are easiest and most common, that are financially viable for councils to recycle.
Yeah.
There's lots of things that can be recycled very easily. There's this cool company called TerraCycle who recycle so many things: pens, razor blades, sweet wrappers, food pouches. And so I have bags of different things at home, stuff that, I feel are unavoidable. I used to just buy big bags of crisps, but now I feel like I could buy all crisps. So we have a bag for crisps, we have a bag for our cheese, we have a bag when it was in COVID, or we had our soap pumps, we now have bars of soap. We have a bag for big bags, and we've just got loads of bags in our garage of stuff that you can take to either your supermarket or you can send to TerraCycle. And like I said, we have this whole scheme at school now where we have these big boxes and they get turned into other things. So it's this like circular economy where it's turned into something new rather than just being thrown away.
Yeah. No, that sounds like the cupboards in our house are full of stuff that every 3 months we take somewhere. But it's getting into the habit, I think, isn't it? Once you're in the habit, it continues, and that's where the difference is.
So I take my daughter to drama on a Tuesday, and while she's there, I go to Tesco once a month, take the stuff, get the bits we need, and then come back, and that's done in one journey. Yeah.
So plastic waste is clearly a big focus for you, but I suppose as well as what we can do around that, what big things that the producers and the government can do around this? How can we get so that there's less packaging in the food that we buy and the consumables that we buy?
Our pound and our shopping counts for a lot. In supermarkets, if you were to buy the single fruit and vegetables rather than the pre-packaged ones, then they would stop selling the package. They stopped selling bananas. I don't know if you've noticed in the plastic bags. They started selling them just sometimes wrapped in cardboard. And this might seem crazy. I'm not going to save the planet, maybe a little. But one of the biggest things you can do is to buy the individual bananas. People go along and they'll see like a pack of 5 and they think, I just want 4, and break one off and leave it behind. No one wants to pick up those sad little bananas on their own. And I think every day, I had a fact, I can't remember what it is, something like 6 million bananas are thrown away just because we don't eat them because they're on their own, either the little individual ones in our fruit bowl or the ones at supermarkets. So some supermarkets are selling those little individual ones, or the gone-off fruit, or the things that don't look great. But if we stop buying the things that have the worst packaging, then they will stop producing it.
Yes. I know we were having a little chat beforehand talking about sustainable food and food waste from bread. So the fact that I know is that 44% of bread baked every day is never eaten. And I'm involved with a company that creates that into beer. But so food waste, as well as the packaging, the food itself is a massive issue. Practical steps that we can take to reduce food waste in our kitchens?
Food waste. I had no idea till I was researching my book. I wrote a book, in case you didn't know, everybody, that it's nearly 10% of the world's emissions. And 10% is just a number, like, what does it mean? Flying is 2.5% of all of our emissions. So 4 times everyone's flying in the whole world is food waste. And that's just food that we have that we just throw away, that we don't eat. And the food waste fact, I think about 80% is from households and 20% is from supermarkets and from restaurants. And it might seem crazy, but the reason is it takes energy to grow and feed and transport stuff. So whether it's a seed being planted to be watered to then grow into a crop, or an animal that's born who's fed and watered to grow into the meat that we eat, that's then killed or cut or culled, that's then taken by our vehicle with carbon emissions to our warehouse that's stored in refrigerators that needs carbon emissions to store them, but then transported to supermarkets where again they're stored in fridges, or just the transportation to get them there, to then get them home to our fridges and our cupboards, yet again with more fossil fuels. The whole journey, before we've even decided whether we cook it or not, already has created huge emissions. So then it sort of seems sacrificial, doesn't it? We care for our food so much more now we have our little allotment. Every single tiny little onion, every single little tiny carrot, we just love it so much because we've grown it. We're never ever going to just leave them to waste. So it's really obvious, but using everything you have, having a meal planner, freezing your leftovers, freezing those bananas, turning them into smoothies, freezing the bread, turning them into a bread butter pudding. there are so many things you can do to reduce food waste, which will save you so much money as well.
Yeah.
And we also have a food waste bin, because food that's left over, whether it's your peelings, whether it's bones, whether it's just the scraps, there's always going to be some food waste that's unavoidable. But if it goes into your bin, it produces methane, which is 13 times more warming than carbon dioxide. But if you can put it into your compost, and lots of councils recycle, and if you don't, you could write to your MP and ask them to stop doing food waste, then that gets turned into compost, and then that stops that emission.
So one of the really difficult things, and I'm quite knowledgeable about sustainable food, one of the difficulties I find, I suspect many of us do, tap your brains about this, is what's the hierarchy, what's the priorities between the things we try and do right, like organic versus non-organic, local versus not local, seasonal versus not seasonal, plant-based versus meat. We're all trying to do this, we're trying to juggle it all, and we're getting confused. And so how, do you have a hierarchy of those things?
It's too complicated, and that's the problem. Seasonal is perhaps one of the most important things, and we've seen that sales of carrots and sales of peas in the UK have gone down hugely because people want more exotic things from across the world. And obviously I used to work with Piers Morgan, and he always used to go on about avocados from across the world, and you're ruining the planet.
Still does.
It still does, yes. But arguably, you know, when I was younger and in the summertime we'd have our new potatoes, I loved that. And then in the winter when you go back to your regular potatoes and you mash them, I love that. I think, are used to having everything all the time. My Charlotte doesn't need strawberries all the time. I want to wait till they're in season, when they're locally grown in the UK, where we haven't flown them from really far away, and they'll be juicier and they'll be tastier, and then we mean that we're paying British farmers for them. So seasonal is really important. Also, when we have things coming from overseas, some things are flown and the emissions are much higher. Some things can be kept in crates and kept cool, and they come on container ships, which cause much fewer carbon emissions. So it's knowing where things come from, how far they've traveled, how we've gotten here. And actually, there are some organic things that we can get from our local farmers or from local producers that potentially will have a higher carbon footprint because they're so well looked after than the mass production overseas, even if it is flown over here. So yeah, it is a minefield. But you know, one thing that's a really big thing is meat. You know, meat produces huge amounts of carbon emissions. And if we just cut our meat consumption by 1 day a week, you know, our Tasty Tuesday, it's the equivalent of taking, I think, 5 million cars off the road in the UK. And meat for the NHS costs them millions of people's health with cardiovascular illnesses, particularly red meat. And if you had vegetables that day over meat, your whole meal would be cheaper. So it's just making those little changes. No one's, you know, I'm not going to say every meal has to be vegan, you can never fly anywhere ever again, because that's not us being able to live our lives. We have to just make those small changes. And when I started making one change, you know, let's have a meat-free day, another meat-free day, okay, let's have a vegan day. When you start making those changes, like I said, they're not sacrifices, they're just tweaks to our lives. And because some of those costs go down, it meant that we could buy better quality local meat from our local butcher.
Yeah. Again, small steps, isn't it? You don't need to become vegetarian or vegan in one go.
Yeah.
Just take it step by step.
Flexitarian.
Flexitarian, that's the word. So we've looked at some specific areas of how we live our lives, but then there's the power to make greener choices and the way we can influence companies, which we touched on, from the brands that we buy and the choices that we make in the supermarket to, I guess, our pensions and how we can influence where they are, which most of us don't think about day to day, and the power that we've got, who we bank with, what electricity supply we have, that sort of thing. What easy ways are there to make better choices there, would you advise us around?
The thing is, you can just think about absolutely everything that you do, everywhere you go, everything you buy. Do you need to buy that product? You know, everything you buy costs money, everything you buy has had an emission put on it. Like I said, where you spend your money is really important. And now people are thinking about the energy providers, whether it's a green energy provider, is that going to be better in your wallet? It may be the same, but it's better on the planet. Where you invest your money, you say, is a really big one. Whether you invest your mortgage with a company that has green initiatives, or they invest their money in green initiatives, whether you invest your actual savings in greener companies as well, is also a really big thing. And I don't think that, I hadn't realized how important it is, because then the more money they have, the more that they can invest, the more that can be upscaled, and the less money goes to the big banks who are making the worst decisions. So they're sort of like the end changes that you might want to think about making and not realizing how powerful they are. But particularly something like people's pensions, where that money's locked away for a long time, then the innovations and technology that changes in that length of time is just huge.
Great, okay. So we've been having a little chat. Let's open it up to everybody. Let's see what other perspectives. Anyone got any questions for Laura? There's a team going around with microphones. You said microscopes, that they're not coming around with them. There's a gentleman there.
Thank you very much. Interesting. Now that the lights are up, you can look out at the audience.
Scary.
Does the demography of the audience concern you?
Why do you think it should?
Well, I'd be quite blunt about it. If you look at the ethnicity of the audience, if you look at the age profile of the audience, I'll even go so far to guess if you looked at the economic sector that the majority of the audience are here, what you are doing this evening is obviously of interest to a, maybe one might say, not particularly representative slice of the population.
Yeah, do you know, that's actually a very good point. And I guess I would like to think that people, have come here because they want to hear about what I have to say and they're on board. And that is the problem, getting the message to the people who are not as interested or don't care or don't know why they should care. And that's why I guess we were talking about my trip to Svalbard. The demographic of Good Morning Britain is housewives, mums, older people, single parent families, not the affluent people in society. Those people arguably would be less likely to have watched an Arctic documentary about how the ice is melting and what's happening to the polar bears. But we reached at any one time 1 million people, and lots of people came up to me from different backgrounds, from different walks of life, saying that it really impacted them and it made them stop and it made them think. But yes, you're right, that it's hard to reach everybody. And I go to lots of places and do lots of talks, but I guess anyone who comes to a talk is already half in. Their foot's already through the door. So how do you reach these other people? I think for me, for people in society who are less affluent, actually it's proven that those people who are poorest in society are going to be most affected by climate change. In high-rise buildings, in city centres, when there's a heat wave, the temperature in the city centre will be 5 degrees higher. When you're in a high-rise, it's up to 2 degrees higher. They're more likely to have lower incomes, not have the facilities to have the fresh meat, have the fresh vegetable, have the more processed foods, have the worse packaging. And I think it's being able to help those people, because not just in the UK, around the world, if you look at Louisiana, where they have huge coastal erosion, where they have mass migration of people, they're called climate migrants now, they've had to move away from the coast because of flooding. They're some of the poorest in the whole of America because they're so disproportionately affected by climate change, they need more people to help them. But I think that has to come from top down to help those people to guide them how saving the planet will also save money. But thinking about installing things, particularly in this world where we have more heat waves in these huge blocks of flats, how we keep those people safe and warm. Because last year when we had our huge heat wave, 3,500 excess deaths were attributed to the excess temperatures, which mostly affected the very poor, the very vulnerable, and the very young.
Thank you. Very thought-provoking question. There was a gentleman down here, so here.
Hello. I've got an answer for you, actually, in your demographics, a little bit. Is that I once read somewhere that the least environmentally friendly people are those people who were in their formative years when the missile crisis was happening. And the nearer you are to total Armageddon, the least likely you're going to think there's going to be an Earth to give to anybody else. And therefore, people who are in their early 60s now really don't care at all. But people above them, the make-do-and-mend Queen, the late Queen, make-do-and-mend types, are a little bit more environmentally friendly. And those people who are born sort of post-CFCs and of course, the Montreal Protocol and all the rest of it, are far more environmentally friendly. So you will have those weird demographic isms of basically reflecting where we are as a globe at the time, various times in your life. That wasn't my question. It wasn't. One of my little bugbears, and you were talking about the different demographics of people who are particularly affluent, is that with your kind of make to men type. There's always a little bit of sneering at sort of Daily Mail Deirdre as she drives around in a little Micra and uses her pensioner pass and everything else. And people just sneer at them whilst they're driving this massive, electric SUV, and their driveway has not a square inch of grass on it. And Daily Mail Deirdre is a keen gardener. And there is that little element where some people can, you kind of mix the two, which is, this is almost a swanking thing. It's sort of, oh, look at me, aren't I environmental? Whereas actually you can just do the make to men stuff, which matters more. But what I was really going to ask is, what would you say the sort of difference or the potential for conflation between the urban heat island effect and climate change itself? Because in those swankers who, with their fully paved driveways, you realise they're taking away, and you're talking about albedo, you're taking away green grass that soaks stuff away, that reflects a fair amount of radiation back into the sky, with a concrete lump in your driveway that's meters and meters and square kilometres worth of it. So, A, what can we do about that, apart from get everyone to plant a tree? And B, how much of that is actually driving the perception of climate change in those suburban areas? Because we've just built them all up, we've made them urban. It's mad.
Yeah, there are so many things there. I do the weather a lot from flower shows. The RHS have a huge campaign called Greening Grey Britain, so making grey spaces greener again. And there's meant to be laws in place that say if you have a driveway, it needs to have a runoff, it needs to have irrigation, you need to make sure that you have compensated for it in a green initiative somewhere. That doesn't always happen, but that is something that the government are aware of these green spaces, which are terrible. One thing I remember when I was at university asking, well, if urban areas having more pavements, that's going to make it hotter. So then that means that those thermometers in those places are sort of misrepresenting how much hotter it's getting, and is the world really getting that hot? Because they're so well calibrated, because they are monitored all the time, and actually the ability to measure temperatures has improved. Technically, the thermometers that we have now are sort of inaccurately reading temperatures because we keep them at the caliber that they have always been measuring temperatures. Everything is compensated for, be it more concrete. But so many of the observation stations all around the world, tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of them, if not more, are not all in massive city centres. So the effect would be minuscule, and it's completely, it doesn't skew the results at all.
Thank you. Anyone else? There's a lady near the microphone just there. Thank you.
Hi, really quick question. Is this like the hottest June on record? It feels the hottest.
It does feel it. Can I just tell you a really cool fact? Today, on the 13th of June, we have never recorded 30 degrees Celsius. Today we broke 30 degrees, and it's the only day in the whole of summer that's never recorded 30 until today. But we're not on track for the hottest, but it will be one of the hottest. It will probably be top 10, and that sort of trend is not good or ideal, but I think welcome news for many people after a really miserable spring.
Nice, great. Gentleman there.
Thank you, Laura, for coming and giving us an interesting talk. There's been a lot of emphasis, of course, on carbon in the atmosphere, and this is produced at the start of the production of electricity. I don't want to talk about hot days, I want to talk about cold days now. We know in the winter in Britain we produce something like 40 gigawatts of power. And I think in 27 years' time, 2050, with electricity being in demand for electric vehicles and so on, it could well be 100 gigawatts that we need. And across Europe, if there's 10 other industrial countries like our own, I think the figure would come out to about 1 terawatt. Have you got any idea how much ice you can melt with 1 terawatt? Because I've calculated out, I might be wrong, and it's based on my 850 watt microwave oven, and I believe it comes out to about 1 million cubic meters of ice per hour.
Wow.
You're a climatologist. Can you tell us what the effect? We know all this electricity that's produced will end up as heat somewhere along the line because it'll escape from buildings They'll escape from electric vehicle engines and so on. And we know it's hotter in cities, as already been mentioned, and in the underground where you've got motors on trains. We know that cities are 2 or 3 degrees higher in temperature. So I've got this feeling that on a cold day in November, all this energy is producing a plume of warm air that's probably, if the prevailing weather is from west to east, maybe all that heatness just from Europe will be going up to the Arctic somewhere, and it may be melting the ice. Can you comment on that? Is my maths somewhere wrong? I know there'll be losses to the atmosphere and so on, but it's a big number. I may have got my noughts in the wrong place. I know there's a lot of noughts in the calculation.
I mean, I would have to check that, but I think you're looking at one thing in isolation, and it's the fact that when we burn fossil fuels, whether it's coal or oil, to produce our electricity, then that creates a greenhouse gas emission, which causes the atmosphere's temperature to rise, which then goes into our oceans, which causes the ocean temperatures to rise, and it's that impacts the changing weather events we've seen all over the world. I went to the largest onshore wind farm when I went to COP26 in Glasgow, and I was talking to the engineer there, and he said that the government's 10-point plan that gets us to net zero means that we need to electrify our grid 10 times. So we need 10 times the electricity capacity we have now to meet the demands that we will have with what is set to be the air source heat pumps, which is what is set to be our electric cars and electric buses and all of the initiatives that we want to have. And he said it is very possible and very doable, and all of that electrification, that tenfold increase, can come from green initiatives. So it will be wind turbines out at sea, and it will be solar panels inland. And we take then the wind for free and the sun for free and convert it into the electricity. That may well have a heating effect, but that will be far outweighed by the effect of the fossil fuels being burnt to produce the same amount of electricity. Okay, but then you have to upscale what the equivalent would be for all of that to have been powered by greenhouse gases.
It's an interesting question and an interesting answer. I'm fascinated. A question over this side, this person very corner.
Hi Laura, thanks so much. It was really interesting. As someone who's already a vegetarian 100% of the time, are there any particular products that are actually pretty on the par with meat in terms of the climate impact? And if so, if you know them and alternatives, that would be great.
Okay. Tofu, probably not one. Soy, and that's the problem. Soy is something that is an easy alternative for people who they want to have, but then soy is so bad for cutting down trees, planting all the soy plants and growing that. For me, it is that we just make sure that we replace our meat with vegetables. Those days, actually, we don't have a meat substitute or meat alternative. We just make sure that they're just completely meat-free days and we have our vegetables and that they're locally sourced. We have those boxes that come with wonky vegetables, and we make sure that we use every single one of those and we love them. But it is a difficult one. You know, we went to having corn, and corn definitely has a lower carbon footprint than it would be if you were having the meat alternative. But for us, it's better just to not have it at all, not have that meat alternative.
Good, thank you. Eating Our Way to Extinction is a film that starts to answer part of your question. It's a person towards the back there. Yes, with your hand up there.
So we're basically trying to help the planet by trying to make it like machines and stuff, and getting power from fossil fuels when we're trying to help it, but we're not helping it also in a way. So why are we trying to help it in that way when we just use something else to help it?
Good question. I think that there are lots of things we have in our everyday life that make things easier that are not so good for the planet. But if we can try and swap the driving of the car, the turning down of our thermostats, if anything we can do to stop fossil fuel production and to have a greener alternative means that the planet won't warm as much, and if it doesn't warm as much, we won't have as extreme weather, we won't have as heavy rain, we won't have as big a droughts. For every 1 degree of warming, the atmosphere holds 7% more moisture. We used to say that severe weather events are becoming more frequent because of climate change. Well, every weather event is already more severe because of climate change. Every time it rains, it's already worse because our atmosphere has warmed by 1 degree. So all the little things that we can do will stop that temperature rise, which will mean that the rain isn't as heavy, the droughts aren't as long, and the heat waves aren't as bad.
Good. Happy with that answer? Good, son. Gentleman down here.
Hello there. I remember being at school in the 1980s and learning that the world's population was 3.5 billion. So in my lifetime, sort of 35 years later, we're now at 8 billion. Mm-hmm. Isn't part of the solution to try and curb the rise of the global population because people are eating more, agriculture is causing emissions, we're consuming more. It might be controversial, but how do we stop the population rising more and contributing to the problem in itself?
So definitely population is a factor. It's one factor, and there's two things there, and I'll come back to the population thing in a second. There's this thing called Earth Overshot Day, and what happens is we look at the consumption of each country, and we look at when you put pro rata, if you wanted the temperature to stay the same, if we go, like you're allocated this much carbon emissions each country, when we would use up the quota per person. And it's the same thing for every single country. And in the UK, it's soon, isn't it? It's like late June, I think early July, when we've used all of our emissions we should use. And from then on, for the rest of the year, we're just using more of the earth, consuming more of the atmosphere, taking in more of the carbon, causing more heating. The change around the world for each country when they reach their Earth Overshot Day is probably a good marker of where we can try and base how we live our lives. Somewhere like Qatar reaches it probably in about February. Somewhere like Morocco, I don't think they actually ever get there. I think that they live their lives in a way that they could be sustainable within themselves, use what they have. It's sunny, it's hot, they have lots of renewables. So I think, first of all, that is looking at how many people live in each country using what we have. Looking at what each country does is really important. And actually, I'll come back to it. People often say, what about China? What about China? If you look at emissions per person, and looking at historic emissions, the UK started the Industrial Revolution. They're, I think, 12th in the world per person for how much carbon they emit a year, and the UK is 13th. So we're just a tiny bit behind them. So we're not that squeaky clean. We compare ourselves to them. But I think that pointing fingers and blaming it doesn't help anyone. But population is huge. And actually, the Western world's population is decreasing. China obviously had a policy that they could only have two children per family to try and keep their population stable, and then their population has dropped, so now they've stopped that because they want to develop their economy and keep the population booming. But one of the really big initiatives, and I was talking about it before, particularly in developing nations, where yes, they have a much smaller carbon footprint, is if you can educate a young girl who is going to be married off young and have 5 or 6 children to not be married off so young, to become a farmer, to make money for her family, to, in that village, the dream would be to have a solar panel and a wind turbine, so they don't have to rely on fossil fuels, they don't have to cable in between the cities and their conurbations, which are so far apart, and then she will have maybe 1 or 2 children, then that helps both the environment in the carbon footprint sense, but it also helps to reduce the population increase. So this is why at the last COP, one of the big things was helping to give money to the developing nations so that they could be as developed as we are. And lots of a proportion of our TV audience was going, well, that's not fair, we want to keep our money over here. But if we help to give our money overseas to make sure that these plans are in place and this education, it helps everybody. So it's a factor that's being looked at, but probably not upscaled as quickly as it should be.
Thank you. Have we got one more question? I think we've got time for one more question. If there is another one, there's one hand over there.
Thank you for this talk. It was very interesting. I guess my question is, when a lot of emissions can be put down to companies, and when a vast majority of emissions can be put down to them, and when you have world leaders who refuse to join treaties for very obviously selfish, like capitalistic sort of reasons. How it's all very depressing. How can you sort of avoid having a defeatist attitude when, yes, there's small things that we can do, but when a vast majority seems to be created by corporations that don't care, basically? Yeah.
I think there's a number of factors there. One is we're talking about generations of people coming through. There was a report out last week to say that 20% of young people looking for jobs won't work for a company that doesn't have green credentials. And I met a guy from BP a few years ago, and he said that they are struggling to recruit new great engineers because young people just don't want to work for them because they're such a polluting company. And it's incredible to think that we would look at our location, we would look at the money, we would look at our prospects for promotion. Now companies are having to become greener, whether they like it or not, or they just won't get the right people working for them to keep their company growing. And this is where, putting the right thing in the right recycling, is that going to save the planet? No, but it's all those little steps that then become bigger steps that then becomes a voice. If you write to your politician and say you're not happy about something in your area, whether it's recycling, apparently if they get 10 letters, they assume that 1,000 people think there's a problem, and then that will make them go and make change because they go, people in my area are really green, let's make sure that becomes our next big policy. So for these things, it's bottom up. I read a piece in the paper last week from a company called Carbon Brief, who are amazing. They write about all the latest stories about climate change around the world, and they were talking to a minister in China, and he said, well, the Western world say, what about China? They don't think we're doing our part. 90% of all buses, electric buses in the world are in China. 80% of all solar panels built in the world were built last year in China, and 60% of wind turbines were produced there. They realize as a nation that there's money to be made in becoming green. So now that Biden's back in the Paris Agreement, and he's got John Kerry, who I met last year, who is really committed to tackling climate change, they are working now finally with China and saying to them, look, let's all play together. Russia are not on board. Brazil have now got a new new president, so the old one, Bolsonaro, didn't care. The new one, he is really interested in protecting the rainforest. I think that it's sort of like a school ground bullying between these leaders to make sure that when they have conversations about anything, that climate change is on the table. But I think companies are realizing they have to become greener, whether the CEO thinks it in his heart or whether he realizes it because he wants to keep the company alive. And I think that it's these small changes that are coming from the bottom up that will help. I think we're just at this real tipping point when they're starting to realize that that is the future if people want to exist in companies or as a country being voted back in again. That's what people are going to care about.
Thank you. So I'll ask a final question, which hopefully is a collection of, we've heard lots of very different perspectives, what people are interested, what they're concerned about. You've talked about the big stuff that's happening, the small stuff that we can do. And, the thing that goes through all of this is life doesn't always make it easy to make the right choices. And so what's your sort of parting message for the simple can-do thing, the way we all leave a little bit more optimistic than we were when we came in?
Okay, so this is sort of my initial mantra. Climate change is three things. It's simple, serious, and solvable. Simple, the Earth is overheating because it's wrapped in a blanket of pollution that we produce. Serious, because of the wildfires we saw in Canada, the temperatures we saw in the UK last year, the flooding in Pakistan. But solvable, that we have everything in our power to solve it. There are some technologies that we don't quite have yet, but we are very close to having them and then upscaling them. But I think that, for me, it's that no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And finger pointing and saying, why don't you do that, doesn't really help anybody. But doing what you can do, and then you start to do more and more and more because you see the positive impacts on your life and your health and your well-being and your wallet, as well as on the planet. I feel like that's the starting place for me.
Fabulous. Thank you, Laura. Thank you. Yes, go.
So I said earlier I would read. So I wrote a book, talked about it a little bit. It's for sale outside. But yes, I wrote a letter to Charlotte. Actually, when I wrote the book, it was going to be called 101 Ways to Save the Planet, and then we got to 150 and 200, and so it's 200 plus, so it's called Everyday Ways to Save the Planet. And I was going to write a letter to the planet to say, I'm really sorry for all the terrible things that we're doing to you, and you know, we'll all try harder. But then I went to Svalbard, and I came back, and I realised that it was Charlotte I needed to write the letter to, which, by the way, she wrote a letter to a polar bear, and I recorded a little video of her, and I said, where's Mummy going? And she said, to Svalbard. And I said, why? She said, because the ice is melting for the polar bears. And I said, and what can we do about it? And then she just did a cartwheel and rolled off down the hill. So she didn't even know. And then I took the letter to Svalbard, and the polar bears are coming closer to where people are living because they have to go in search for food, and because the ice is melting more, they just keep coming closer and closer, so you can't leave without a guide. Someone has a gun all the time. It's actually illegal to shoot a polar bear and kill it, but if you had to, for self-preservation, you'd have to prove it and go to court. And anyway, we lived, I'm here. But my editor actually said to me, are you going to give that letter to a polar bear? I did not give the letter to a polar bear. I gave the letter to the guy who runs Norwegian Polar Institute, and it's on his wall. We didn't see any polar bears. Okay. So this is to Charlotte. They say there are 7 wonders of the world, but to me, there's only one, you. On this whole amazing planet, you're the most special of all in my eyes. So this letter is to tell you that I'll do everything I can to make sure that you can see all the wonders our world has to offer. I'm sad some of them will only be alive in stories and photos or memories from other people. Will I be able to take you to Svalbard to see the beautiful fjords that stretch as far as the eye can see? Will you see polar bears and reindeer, or will they be long gone? One thing is for certain, if you stand where I stood, the landscape will look very different. I'm sorry. I'm sorry we've polluted all of our oceans and all of our skies. I'm sorry that the ice is melting and the seas are rising. I promise I'll do everything I can to save our planet. I promise I'll let nature flourish like it did in the pandemic. When the world healed, the pollution cleared, we breathed fresh air and we could hear birdsong. I hope I will inspire lots of people to start making small but important changes. I hope I can take you to see animals on the brink of extinction being reintroduced to the wild, and that tiny low-lying islands that were once under threat have been saved. I hope that when you reach my age, perhaps with children of your own, we will have stopped our warming of Earth so other people can enjoy it as much as I do. Charlotte, I love you and I love our planet. I want to protect you and I want to protect it. I do this all for you, my number one wonder of the world.
Wonderful. I think that's a great point to give a round of appreciation to Laura for giving up her evening. Thank you. Wonderful. So I'm sure we're all going to leave here tonight inspired with some great ideas of how we can personally try and make a difference. You know, I'm trying to process this fantastic, simple, solvable, serious and solvable. You know, I'm remembering how the small steps and taking one step at a time and trying to deal with one issue at a time works, and how the accumulation of all those small things, when they become habits, become in place. So. And I think what I'm taking as well is the variety of questions, of which we were all nodding around the questions, shows how much we're connected, and the power of something like communal engagements like this. Very personally, you've made me reflect on how, as Chancellor of the University of Reading, one of the things I try and do whenever I host a dinner is to sort of flip what the normal is by having, when the menu goes, saying the menu is a vegetarian menu, but when you ask for dietary requirements, say everyone's very welcome to have meat. You just opt into meat rather than opt out of opt into vegetarian. And the meals go from 80-20 meat based to 80-20 vegetarian based, just by that simple perspective changing. And I was just reflecting how I should do that at home with our barbecues and our dinner parties for our friends and things. So lots that we can do. So once again, going back to the beginning, we're delighted to be working in partnership with the organisations and the local community here as part of Reading's Climate Festival, and there's still a lot more to come. On Thursday evening, we are delighted to welcome Reading's very own Right Honourable Sir Alok Sharma MP who was president of COP26, who will be in this room and providing the opening address for a panel debate on empowering young people to tackle the greatest challenge of their generation, featuring leading representatives from the education sector, from NGOs, from youth activists, for what I'm sure will be a positive and inspiring debate. The event will discuss the latest progress in embedding climate understanding across the education system, in supporting those anxious about the future, and ensuring that future generations have the skills and knowledge to thrive in a green economy. Places are still available and bookable free of charge on what's on reading.com, just as this event was. So thank you for participating. Thank you in advance for the pledges that you'll all take home and make and do, no matter how big or small. I know Laura is going to be very willing to go and do some signed copies for your book, I think, which is can be bought at reception, should you need further inspiration.
I just say, sorry to interrupt you. When I wrote the book, the publishers said, we've allowed 8 pages for climate change at the beginning, and I'd actually written 90. Slight compromise, there's 40 pages of questions and answers.
Oh, I bet they loved you. Excellent. So let's hope that tonight's talk, the opportunity to visit Gaia, has inspired you. Thank you. One more round of applause for Laura, please.